Come with me for a minute back to the early 1970s. Why? Because that's when I started to look into nutrition, and I've been struggling with it ever since. I remember that when I first started exploring this fascinating science, I came across a quote by Mark Twain. Part of the secret of success in life is to eat what you like and let the food fight it out inside. And I thought to myself at that time, gee, he was a clever man, but this really must have been some sort of sarcastic remark. Surely it's possible to figure out exactly what is going on in the body and what we should be eating. Well, as I suggested, I've been struggling with that ever since. And I don't think I'm going to have the final answer for you. But we will take a rather interesting journey. So why was Mark Twain so concerned at that time, and why was he puzzled? Because of all the nutritional activities going on back in those days in the 1800s, Sylvester Graham, for example, of Graham cracker fame, was telling people to stay away from meat, to never drink water with a meal, and to eat only whole grain products, whole grain bread. He even had recipes and a book about that. And it was an advice that was, a mixture of sense and nonsense. And then there was also Horace Fletcher, who came to be known as the Great Masticator. Why? Because his idea was that it didn't really matter what you ate as long as you chewed it to a pulp, because that's the way it would be most easily digested. And then there was John Harvey Kellogg, and of course it is after him that the Kellogg Company is named, because he and his brother Will were the originators of the company, and he was adamant against meat. He said that this is something that was not fit for humans to eat, and as you can see, his rather inflammatory rhetoric. Well, contrary to Kellogg, we have Dr. James Salisbury, who thought that all of this eating of grains for animals, not for humans. And he suggested that health lay in eating the Salisbury steak. Well, as you can see, there was all of this conflicting opinion back in those days, so it really isn't surprising that Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens was so puzzled by all of this. Well, you would think that by now we would have figured it all out, and that the plate that awaits us, we would know what to put on it. Well, I wish that were really true. We have some pretty good ideas about nutrition, but unfortunately, there's also a lot of conflicting stuff. Some people tell us, well, go ahead and fill it up with the eggs and the potatoes that are fried. It doesn't matter, it's not going to have any effect on your health. Others say, whoa, you can't really do that. You got to eat the whole grains, the oat bran, and the berries. And then, of course, we have all kinds of regulatory agencies who want to make their mark. The United States has a plate called Choose My Plate. And as you can see, it isn't really all that informative. I mean, it's nice and colorful, but I don't know how one would put that to any sort of a practical use, other than seeing that vegetables really are quite important. But when you look at the protein recommendation, well, I mean, that protein can be anything. It could be soy protein, it could be meat. There's no way to distinguish here. The Harvard plate is somewhat more informative, called the Healthy Eating Plate, because they give us a lot more detail about what we should be eating and what not. For example, when they look at proteins, they will make a distinction between the kind of proteins that we should be eating, and they urge us to stay away from the processed meats. They also don't emphasize dairy products, and the healthy oils are of the polyunsaturated variety. Well, this is a plate that we will come back to a little bit later. And if we go around the world, there are other countries where there is a plate full of advice, equally uninterpretable. I think this one comes from the UK. And then we have some philosophical arguments that play into this picture as well. We have those people who believe that it's the low-carb diet with lots of fats in there, and that's where health lies. And then we have the vegans, who of course want to stay away from any kind of animal product altogether, and they have their own version of the plate. And just to make those vegans somewhat unhappy, we have the worshippers of the paleo diet, who say that just pile on the meat. That's where health lies. And then finally, we have the calorie-restricted version plate. and eat less. Doesn't matter what you eat as long as you don't eat it. That's the philosophy here. And interestingly enough, you know what? Of all these plates that we've discussed, this one probably has the most scientific evidence, because what we do know is that calorie restriction really can extend longevity. Of course, it doesn't make for very pleasant longevity. There certainly is no dearth of information out there. There are books and books and books galore about what to eat, what not to eat, how to make sure that we're going to be healthy by referring to specific foods. However, here too, the opinion is very often divided, and one side calls the other one a fibber, and it goes back and forth, and it all turns out to be pretty confusing. Things change. If we go back to 1984, Time magazine had this fascinating cover, of course, suggesting that eggs and bacon were a problem because of the cholesterol content. Well, by 1999, that had changed somewhat, and same magazine. And this time, eggs, well, they were no longer the bad boy, because by this time, studies had showed that an egg a day actually was okay. So back and forth like that it goes. You can pick books off the shelf that tell you that lowering your blood cholesterol is essential, that that's how you prevent heart disease. And then, of course, you also have the books that tell us that we're all being conned by going on this lowering cholesterol bandwagon. What's the truth? Well, the truth lies somewhere in between. I think we will see as we explore this fascinating issue that the whole cholesterol story has perhaps been overemphasized, and that lowering cholesterol by diet is a very difficult thing to do, and exactly what sort of diet will do that is questionable, and whether it's worthwhile doing it is also questionable. But let's see whether or not we can come to some sort of conclusion, although as we meander through, we will have to go through a lot of tunnels, and there will not always be a light at the end of the tunnel. And sometimes that light will be an approaching train. But let's start at the beginning. And the beginning sort of lies with Ancel Keys, an American physiologist, well noted for his nutritional explorations, in fact so well noted that he eventually made it onto the cover of Time magazine. And when you do that, you know that you've achieved something. Well, what did he achieve? He laid the foundation for the so-called lipid hypothesis, the notion that heart disease is linked to cholesterol levels in the blood, and that those cholesterol levels are linked to saturated fat in the diet, or in general, overall fat content of the diet. So what did Keys actually do? By the time that he came to carry out his work, he knew that Nikolai Anichkov in Russia had carried out some pretty interesting experiments with rabbits. He had fed rabbits with cholesterol and determined that this led to the buildup of deposits in the arteries of these animals, and that those deposits eventually were capable of triggering heart attacks. Now, of course, a rabbit is not exactly the same as a human, and a rabbit normally does not have any cholesterol in its diet. So the meaning of the study was rather questionable, but it was enough to intrigue Keys. Keys also knew about the work of John Goffman, an American, who found that cholesterol was carried around in the bloodstream mixed together with proteins. And this complex, known as a lipoprotein, had an interesting impact on disease. And Goffman had concluded that the lipoproteins were somehow linked to heart disease, and of course cholesterol was at the heart of these lipoproteins. And because cholesterol was found in fatty foods, Keys thought, gee, you know, maybe it would be a good idea to take a look at heart disease rates around the world and see whether or not they were linked to diet. And thus started the lipid hypothesis for heart disease.